Okay, this section has to do with the crime bill, incarceration rates, and this is where, in my opinion, she loses this section. So let's go.
I want to turn to the subject of crime. As most of you know, 2 weeks ago, an Uber driver in Kalamazoo, which is 2 hours from where we are tonight, went on a shooting rampage, killing 6 people, injuring 2 people. One of the injured was a 14-year-old girl. Her name is Abigail Koff. She was shot in the head, her heart stopped, she was on life support. It looked like she might not make it, but amazingly, Abigail pulled through. Her father, Gene Koff, is here tonight, and I know, Gene, you have a question, but before you ask your question, I just want to ask, how is Abigail doing tonight?
She's now laughing and giggling, but she has a long road of physical recovery.
I should point out you are leaning toward Senator Sanders, but I know you have a question that applies to both candidates. We'll first toss it to Secretary Clinton. What's your question?
The United States has had a rash of mass shootings over the years. 42 shootings in the United States this year alone. The man who shot everyone, including my daughter in Kalamazoo, had no mental health issues reported and had a clear background. What do you plan to do to address this serious epidemic? I don't want to hear anything about tougher laws for mental health or criminal backgrounds, because that doesn't work.
Secretary Clinton?
Well, first of all, I'm looking at your daughter and I'm very grateful that she's laughing and she's on a road to recovery. But it never should have happened. You know, on average, 90 people a day are killed by gun violence in our country. I think we have to try everything that works to try to limit the numbers of people and the kinds of people who are given access to firearms. The Brady Bill, which has been in effect now for about 23 years, has kept more than 2 million purchases from going forward. So we do have to continue to try to work on that, because not every killer will have the same profile. But the comprehensive background checks, closing the gun show loophole, closing the online loophole, closing what's called the Charleston loophole, where you get a gun at the end of 3 days, even if the background check is not completed, which is what the killer in Charleston did, and then they found out later he shouldn't have gotten the gun, that he killed 9 people at Mother Emanuel Church. I also believe so strongly, Gene, that giving immunity to gun makers and sellers was a terrible mistake, because it removed any accountability from the makers and the sellers. And it also disrupted what was a very promising legal theory to try to get makers to do more to make guns safer, for example, to try to give sellers more accountability for selling guns when they shouldn't have. So that is an issue that Senator Sanders and I differ on. I voted against giving them immunity, but I think we should very seriously move to repeal that and go back to making sure gun makers and sellers are like any other business. They can be held accountable. And then I do think we've got to have a public...
Thank you.
Well, we've got to have a public discussion, because we have created a culture in which people grab for guns all the time. And there's got to be a way to have more warning signals and more efforts to try to stop that from happening.
I want to go to Senator Sanders.
Like with the man who shot your
Senator
daughter.
Sanders.
I remember President Obama being on television maybe 3 months ago. I'm sure the Secretary remembers as well. She knows the president, I know the president, and he's, generally speaking, in public at least, not a very emotional guy. And he, after the mass killing in Oregon, if my memory is correct, he said, look, to be honest with you, let's be honest, nobody has a magic solution to this problem. Any lunatic tomorrow, any person can walk into a theater and do something horrific, and you know what? For us to tell you that that absolutely will not happen would be untrue. But what the president said, he said, look, this is a tough issue, but we have got to do everything we possibly can to minimize the possibility of these mass killings. You're looking at a guy who comes from a rural state, no gun control. I have a D- voting record from the NRA. You're looking at a guy who in 1988 lost a statewide election for Congress because I was the only candidate who said, you know what, I don't think it's a great idea in this country to be selling military-style assault weapons which are designed to kill people.
Sanders.
I lost that election by 3 votes. I agree with what the Secretary said. We need to expand and improve the instant background checks. Bottom line is, people who should not have guns in America should not be able to buy guns in America.
Secretary Clinton mentioned the so-called Charleston loophole, what she's called the Charleston loophole. Is that something, if you were president, you would work to extend
Absolutely,
that 3-day?
I agree. Absolutely. Look, that bill had some sensible provisions. It had the banning of bullets that pierce policemen's armor. Is that a good thing? I think we want to get rid of that. That particular legislation had safety locks on guns so the kids do not pick them up and shoot them. That bill had bad things in it.
So you would
what I
want
have said,
longer than 3-day waiting?
absolutely, that was a very arbitrary decision. What that real debate was about, as you may or may not know, was about how long it would take for the instant background check to go into effect. I wanted that instant background check to go into effect as soon as possible. That was the most important part of that bill.
Secretary Clinton.
Okay. There's no easy answer on that gentleman's question. Because as long as there is a Second Amendment which allows people the right to bear arms, you're going to continue to have this problem. And a guy could be perfectly fine today, perfectly good with the handling of his firearms, etc., and then all of a sudden gets ticked off about something or has an episode and just go out there and start shooting people like the guy did in Michigan. And there's absolutely nothing that you can do to foresee that or to stop that. So as long as guns are as readily available and are legal in the United States, this is going to happen, and there's just nothing that you can do about it.
Actually, Senator Sanders, let me continue to follow up. Because Secretary Clinton mentioned the liability, right now, families of Sandy Hook victims announced that they are going to sue Remington, which made the AR-15, which was used in the Newtown massacre. Now, those families believe that Remington, the distributors, the sellers should be held legally responsible for how their product is used. Now, the lawsuit may not go anywhere because of the bill you voted for, legislation that prevents gun makers from being sued. Tonight, what do you say to those families?
Well, this is what I say, if I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong. If you go to a gun store and you legally purchase a gun, and then 3 days later, you go out and you start killing people, is the point of this lawsuit to hold the gun shop owner or the manufacturer of that gun liable? If that is the point, I have to tell you I disagree. I disagree because you hold people, in terms of this liability thing, where you hold manufacturers' liability is if they understand that they're selling guns into an area that is getting into the hands of criminals, of course they should be held liable. But if they are selling a product to a person who buys it legally, what you're really talking about is ending gun manufacturing in America. I don't agree with that.
Well, that is not what happened. And I think it's important for people to understand. Because of the proliferation of guns, because of the epidemic of gun violence in our country, there were a group of cities, states, and other concerned people who, in the late 90s and in the early 2000s, were working on legal theories that they thought would force gun makers to do more to make guns safer and force sellers to be much more responsible. The NRA saw this happening, and they said, we've got to stop it. Last thing in the world we want is to have guns that you can only shoot with your fingerprint, or to have guns with such strong safety locks on them that they may not be sellable. So the NRA went to the Congress, and the head of the NRA has said this was the most important NRA legislation in more than 20 years. And they basically went to the Congress. I was there. I was in the Senate. And they said, give us absolute immunity. No other industry in America has absolute immunity. And they sell products all the time that cause harm, and they're held responsible.
As I understand, as I understand it, what you're really talking about is not what Secretary Clinton is responding to. As I understand it, and maybe I'm wrong on this, but what you were essentially saying, what people are saying, is that if somebody who is crazy or a criminal or a horrible person goes around shooting people, the manufacturer of that gun should be held liable. And if that is your position, then what you are saying, essentially, if that is the case, as I understand it, it's not what Secretary Clinton is looking at. I agree with what she said. But if that is the case, then essentially your position is there should not be any guns in America, period.
Now, I understand. Like the NRA position.
Can I finish, please? All right? And there are people who hold that view, and that's fine if you hold it. I think what you do is you hold those people who have used the gun accountable. You try to make guns as safe as possible, but I would disagree on that.
We're going to move on, Don.
All right, well, he's absolutely right, because if you want to take that all the way back to the manufacturer, then you basically are telling the manufacturer that if a gun is sold to someone who commits a crime, and they can roll that liability all the way back to them, you're basically saying that the gun manufacturers can't make guns. And then you're going to have a major problem there as far as the Second Amendment is concerned. It's never going to work. So like I said, it's either, we do whatever we can, obviously, to try to mitigate the amount of gun violence. But at the end of the day, unless you are willing to repeal the Second Amendment, we are just going to see this, and there's no two ways about it.
Anderson, I just want to finish, because I know some of the parents from Sandy Hook. I want people in this audience to think about what it must feel like to send off your first grader, little backpack maybe on his or her back, and then the next thing you hear is that somebody has come to that school using an automatic weapon, an AR-15, and murdered those children. Now, they are trying to prevent that from happening to any other family. And the best way to do that is to go right at the people. We talk about corporate greed. The gun manufacturers sell guns to make as much money as they can make.
Senator Sanders.
I think it is a little bit... Look, what happened at Sandy Hook, what happened in Michigan, what has happened far too often all over this country is a terrible, terrible tragedy. And we have got to do everything we can, as I mentioned a moment ago, to end these mass killings. But as I understand what your question is, and you're not the only person whose heart was broken. I was there in the Senate when we learned about this killing. It is almost unspeakable to talk about some lunatic walking into a room. I mean, it is hard to even talk about. We all feel that way. But if, as I understand it, Anderson, and maybe I'm wrong, what you're really talking about is people saying, let's end gun manufacturing in America. That's the implications of that.
We're gonna move on, Don Lemon.
All right, thank you very much, Anderson. As a black...
All right, I'm going to end this section right here, because I think this one is going to go fairly long.